Welcome everyone to the second seminar of our Decolonising Academia, Realization and Beyond seminar series. I'm Tawseef, the moderator of today's seminar. I'm a PhD scholar at the School of International Development of the University of East Anglia. In the last seminar, our experts deliberated on how the putative position of being apolitical can have definite political underpinnings. In my understanding, a very interesting point that flagged towards the last part of the conversation, however, was how the discourses related to decolonizing academia remain mostly confined to certain disciplines only. So today, we try to engage with the basic premise of understanding decolonization in the present context and how it is embedded in our academia. This helps us serve our aim of understanding the significance of decolonization in academic settings, as well as realizing the role that academics can play in challenging colonial structures that form the foundations of the modern world. As a matter of fact, the student population in universities across the UK has had a demographic shift, but the curriculum remains somewhat unchanged. There have been definite changes in terms of technological developments, but not really with regard to the shifting social composition and ideologies. And in this regard, the UCU report of 2016-17 becomes significantly telling. As per the report, in the academic year 2016-17, there were only 25 black women professors compared to 14,000 white men professors, giving us a ratio of 560 to 1. I hope the figure sets the stage for us to start our session. So today, we are joined by our experts who've been doing practical as well as academic work in the field of decolonizing academia and decolonization at large. So we are joined by Professor Dibyesh Anand, head of the School of Social Sciences at the University of Westminster, London, and Dr. Claire Hynes, lecturer in the Literature and Creative Writing at the School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing, University of East Anglia, Norwich. Claire, Dibyesh, I welcome you both. So before we commence, a slight heads up for the audience as well. Our session would be about an hour long, and we're really sorry we had some technical glitches. That's where there was a little delay. So our first part of this session, it would be about 40 minutes, where we'll try and take up the conversation style. And the second part would be a question and answer session, where we take up the questions that are sent by you. So please feel free to submit your questions for Q&A at any time during the program. So if I may first switch to Claire for the first question. Claire, when did you first come across the term decolonize, and what did it mean to you then, and what does it mean to you now?
Okay, so I first came across the term decolonizing when I was an undergraduate very many years ago in the last century. And as part of my degree, I was studying African literature and came across the Ngugi's Decolonising the Mind. And this was a text which really resonated with me. So Ngugi discusses the way in which African languages have been devalued and suppressed and the impact on the individual. And those ideas really kind of struck a chord with me in terms of my own experience. Although I'm British, I have family from Antigua in the Caribbean. And just growing up and hearing those languages and the beauty of them, the richness, and realizing that in the world around me and in universities, these weren't languages that were considered valuable. So that's when I first came across the term and helped me to kind of think about myself and my place in the world. And then I guess more recently over the years, the Rose Must Fall movement, the My Curriculum White movement. Again, this is something that came around, and within the universities, I think when the idea first was being discussed, it was considered something that was very subversive. But now I think it's a term which really helps us to think about the way in which universities have been were established at the time in which empire was, the links with empire and universities, and the idea that they're it's inextricably linked. We can't really see universities as being separate. This was where discourses of racism were came around. So I think really it's paying attention to that and paying attention to the changes that we need to make as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. I quite agree to this. So we take these knowledges and worldviews from the universities and then we move out to the world. Dibyesh, if I would ask you the same question, when did you first encounter the term decolonize and has the meaning of it evolved since then?
Thank you, Tausif. Again, in terms of, for me, decolonize as a term and word, I started being familiar with it when I was studying history at University of Delhi St. Stephen's College in India, right? So undergraduate. But decolonization was simply about process. So what happens when formal colonization gets over? That's what the meaning was. Then I remember coming to the UK and we did read a bit about decolonization of mind, decolonization of culture, and decolonization is more than political process. But that's the familiarity bit. So when I came to the UK, I recall not the master's program. When I started my PhD, around that point in time, my focus was on Tibet, right? I started reading more and more about post-colonial theory. The more I read post-colonial theory, I could see there's a lot of focus on decolonization in general, but much of it was about decolonization vis-a-vis West and non-West, right? So the notion was once the formal colonization of Europe is over, whether we have decolonization in reality or not. That was the debate. And you could imagine that if I'm studying Tibet, which is a colony of China, then there is always a dispute where I find post-colonial theory to offer me the right tools, but no post-colonial theorist at that point in time would ever talk of colonization by non-Western countries. Right? For me, therefore, from the very beginning, apart from the undergraduate years, decolonization was something where I find it's an amazing idea. It's a good idea. It's more than academics. It's about idea. It's about activism for me, right? It was something that should offer us tools, but much of post-colonial theories or even decolonial theory later, which we find now, focus still on remnants of Western influence, Eurocentrism, and they hardly talk about non-Western imperialisms and non-Western colonization. That's how I see the term decolonization.
Oh, yeah, that's quite interesting indeed, because it evolves like a universe. You unpack, and there's so many layers, so many dimensions, and so many perspectives from which you can look at it. Claire, here, when we talk about decolonizing academia, especially in the so-called global north where we are, why do you think it has become important over the time? Like, what gives it this mileage, which increases its significance?
I think it's become increasingly significant or seen as increasingly important because universities are supposed to be spaces in which anyone can do well, anyone can thrive. So it's built on the idea of meritocracy, and then the idea. And then that becomes deeply problematic when research and statistics show that actually some students are advantaged by the system and others aren't. And so when we have clear evidence that shows that there's an ethnic pay gap, there's a gender pay gap, there's a gap in attainment for certain students, particularly Black students and Black and Brown students, then this means that the university, can't has to act. It can't keep that idea going if there's this clear evidence. So I guess on a main that this is helpful in some ways in terms of progressing the decolonizing cause, because yeah, how can the university continue in this way if it's like, okay, well yeah, I'm very sorry, but you're not bringing particular experiences into the university system, perhaps that are acknowledged, or particular ways of seeing the world which are acknowledged, and for others it's very different. So I think it's that, and also it's become important because students increasingly are saying that it's important, whatever their backgrounds. They're saying, look, we're coming to university, we're paying all this money, and look, there's evidence here that actually there are particular forms of knowledge which I'm being taught, and they're being presented to me as if this is knowledge, this is some kind of pure objective form of knowledge, but actually there are all these other systems of knowledge that aren't actually being being introduced, being valued, being taught.
Yeah, that's quite interesting because, like, we don't now talk about our knowledge, but knowledges and whose perspective you're taking to look at a certain thing or a certain point of view. Dibyesh, what would you like to add to this? Why has this decolonizing academia become more important and significant over the time?
I think, well, as Claire, to add to Claire, what Claire was saying, that it has significantly come from students rather than many academics. While academics have written about, produced knowledge and debated about coloniality, decoloniality, post-coloniality, and anti-racist knowledge and everything, but much of academic knowledge production is highly theoretical and therefore confined to conferences where there are 12 academics who speak to each other and no one else will understand. I mean, I was just looking at my own book before we start conversing, where I wrote about Tibet and everything else, right? I look at the language I use. That language is something that most people who are not schooled into academia will not understand. And the reason I highlight this is because imagine that I produce a book around Tibet, Western imagination of Tibet. And most Tibetans in exile, remember, we can't access Tibetans under Chinese occupation. That itself is a problem. But most Tibetans in exile who are educated, who are literate, who are studying, they said to me that they can't understand what I'm arguing, right? So why is that? I don't think it's me who wrote it, because that's how you have to write if you're doing a PhD, right? So PhD process is one where we talk of radical ideas sans radical politics, right? That's radical practice. That's it. So I do think that decolonizing the academia thing comes largely from students, number one. And then, of course, some of us then become allies there, or we were students and then we become academics and we work in partnership. That's where it comes from. Now, when we look at decolonizing academia, if you Google for it, you'll think that, okay, that's a trend. Everyone accepts, everyone agrees, right? That's not the case. We know there's a lot of resistance. While we may agree, and many of us who might be listening to us might agree more or less is what the wider ethos, and most universities will say, yes, we should talk of decolonizing and diversifying and everything else because that's good for business, number one. That's what students want, neoliberal language. But they'll also say, because that's good. But the fact is there's still a lot of resistance to it. The resistance to decolonizing comes from not necessarily from university management structure. It comes from fellow academics. It can also come from fellow students, but significantly in the UK context. And if you look at the language of the Equalities Minister, when we look at the language of Home Minister, when we look at Home Secretary, rather, we look at the language of the government here. Thankfully, Trump lost election there, right? At least if you look at the language, they are the ones who see white privilege. Any talk of white privilege, any talk of critical race theory, any talk of anything as a problem. So we do know that this is a wider debate within society. And one final point I'll make here is the any privilege. In this case, it would be white privilege, right? But in Indian context, it would be Brahmanical Hindu privilege. In other contexts, it would be a Sunni Islamist privilege. I mean, it could be anything. So privilege functions through first suppressing, and when they realize they can't suppress, they'll appropriate and then to make it into their own. So there's also a trend in the UK, I find, where liberal white academics, and I'm using not liberal in good sense, right? Liberal in certain sense, will say, yeah, of course, we all into decolonization. And then they become the authors and the champions of decolonization, and they'll tell the non-white people that this is how you should decolonize. So, right? It's not that. It's never the liberals who started it. It came from radical scholarship, and it also came, as I said, from largely non-white, I'm using that term, non-white bodies and ideas of students and staff.
Absolutely, I do agree with it, and there is like a big struggle where we actually like it's beyond diversification and more about changing these power structures and power relations. You picked up a very important point where even upholding these things might be good for the business of the universities. This brings another question to my mind. At a time, and this question is to Claire, when we know that usually our universities, like it's mostly argued that they are run like corporates, interwoven in bureaucracies, where the main struggle is about getting grants, number of publications, citations, and all. How do you think these things impact these struggles of movements like decolonizing academia?
Yeah, I think the various struggles and the bureaucracy of universities means that in some ways it's a way of people saying, well, you know, this is too much. We have enough on our plate with doing the TEF and the KEF and the REF and all the other kind of acronyms. So that can be used as a way of kind of resisting the work. But also, I think because of the ways in which we have all these various sorts of teaching standards, research standards, you know, that it's a way of kind of presenting, you know, the idea that this is a level playing field, as if anyone can compete, and you just have to follow these particular guidelines and you know, go through peer reviews and all the rest of it, and that it's, you know, that's equal for everyone. And these systems don't take into consideration the fact that, you know, racism exists, sexism exists, homophobia, and then it's harder for some people to compete in you know, on those on the same, in the same way. But also we have to ask, well, who is deciding this, and who decides? You know, it's almost as if these things are presented to us as if they're all kind of perfectly reasonable. And you know, in the words of Audre Lorde, it's using the master's tools. Can we use these tools to dismantle the house?
Yeah, quite agree. And a very interesting point that you talked about was the set standards, where we are supposed to take certain things as a given and take them as normal. That brings another question into the mind that I'd like to know from Dibyesh. When we talk about issues of knowledge production and epistemologies, especially with regard to the higher education in UK, in our universities, what seems to be what usually is called this Eurocentric protocol of writing, with a set structure of how we make the academic arguments, how we build our writings, how we phrase things, the literature reviews, other things, what sort of protocols we follow. Do you think decolonization efforts, they are hindered by how knowledge is expected to be produced, if we talk about our UK higher education system?
Yeah, of course, as standard is connected to standardization, right? The idea is we need to standardize in order to have a certain kind of consistency. Then the question is, whose consistency, whose standards, right? It's a familiar debate which we all, I mean, which we are aware of, that this is how it happens. Now, for me, the question, of course, is that REF, TEF, and KEF, I mean, all these Fs and exercises are highly bureaucratic exercises, right? They do, in a way, assert certain kind of standard, which is Eurocentric. But, and I'm adding a but here, maybe this is because of my experience of having managed some of these processes, right? And this is, I guess, an advantage in learning as a bureaucrat within the university while being an academic also is, I do find that there are ways in which we can use them. So let me give you an example. One could say that REF or even TEF, excellence and all of this, you know, they would adopt a certain straight white male standard, right? Or at best, straight white female standard, something along those lines, right? And that is very much possible. But the fact of the matter is, these exercises are the ones that also, for tokenistic purpose, maybe that's the aim, but they do ask on EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion. Now, we do know that EDI can become tokenistic and is often tokenistic. But without EDI, even formal recognition of EDI, half of us will not exist, right? So in a way, sometimes we do need that legal framework, which is potentially tokenistic, to actually get in and then expand the space. So the way I see, for instance, take research excellence framework. 10 years ago, it was all about academic production, right? So it's about high quality journals, 3-star, 4-star, whatever stars, right? Impact journal. Clearly, you could see who that would privilege mostly, right? Now, there's within REF, this impact. What impact do you have beyond academia? Who does it help? Now, it can help also the old conventional people, but mostly the old conventional professors are the ones who see impact as problematic because they don't make impact beyond academia. Remember, they have on, and I would include myself in that earlier, is we grew up in a system where the idea was your language has to be opaque, your language has to be scholarly and therefore not accessible to others. But now with the impact agenda, the kind of things, let's say, I do around my activism on Tibet or Kashmir can be seen as impact. You see, so what I'm saying is sometimes these exercises that might be meant for something else do allow some scope for things beyond academia. So if you take example of equality, diversity, inclusion, you take example of Oxbridge. Oxbridge will say, oh, well, they're not diverse at all, but they will get high quality students, what they call high quality students from China, India, and elsewhere, and say, oh, but we have got non-white people. But we know that's not diverse, right? But they are the ones, the culture of Oxbridge kind is the one that privileges certain kind of merit. But universities that are not Oxbridge and universities that have accidentally, for various reasons, have more non-white students, and I'll include my university. My university is one of the most diverse in the world. But we are also one that can more easily and more committed to inclusion. So what I'm trying to argue is, or trying to say is that yes, knowledge production is Eurocentric. That's the standard used in various parts of the world. Maybe we'll discuss that later. What are non-Western countries doing now, right? But we also have to be aware that at this point in time, we live in a world which has been shaped by European ideas, right? So, for instance, just saying it's Eurocentric, it is Eurocentric, but some, for instance, let's change the subject. Human rights. A lot of scholars say human rights is Western idea. It's a Eurocentric idea. Well, who are the political leaders who have been arguing that human rights is not universal but Western? Mahathir, China, Singapore, right? All these leaders who then somehow argue that there's a Malaysian culture and Malaysian value and Chinese value, or Narendra Modi talking of Indian value as if 1.2 or 1.3 billion or whatever 600 million people are same value. We do know that a lot of time challenge to Europeanization can come from a certain, not nativism, but certain form of nation status project in non-Western worlds that are equally imperial as opposed to human rights. So it's not surprised that most human rights organizations in Asia and Africa insist on human rights being universal, while the political leaders, partly flirting with fascism, sometimes very openly fascist, are the ones who will talk of Western value versus Eastern value. So for me, therefore, coming back to knowledge production, yes, it's important that we challenge Eurocentrism, and that's what we have to keep aiming for. But we also have to challenge all forms of nation statism, because we should not just focus on Eurocentrism and then reassert a Chinese school of IR or an Indian school of politics and culture, because that would be equally problematic.
That's a very interesting point. And you talked about this tokenism in education. Claire, decolonization and tokenism or diversity, where like we don't challenge the power relations, as I said earlier. Most of the time, what is said is that we talk about diversity, which is very comfortable, but then it doesn't challenge the power relations. The dominated are still the dominated. They don't come into the position where they are looked with equal significance and with respect. How important do you think is it to recognize this risk of tokenism in decolonizing academic efforts? And how should it be addressed?
Yeah, so I think it's really important that it's recognised, and I think it's very easy for institutions to claim that decolonising is happening, but often it can be used as a way of it's almost as if anything can be presented as being decolonising, you know, and it could be used as a way of talking about you know, it's about equality or its inclusion or its representation or its, you know, and diversity, as you say. So and then the danger is as well that it just becomes some kind of tick box exercise that people can say, well, we're doing it. You know, you can see the bits of paper, the documents, or whatever it is, or this little scheme that was started up and didn't continue. So there are various ways in which people can present something as being decolonising where there's no real change. And then the other part of your question was how can it be addressed? Well, I think it can be addressed in the first instance by people calling it out. And I just welcome more people to do that. Often I feel like I'm the one person who's doing it, and it would be helpful if you know, more white colleagues in particular could do that and support. And ask questions and challenge and keep challenging and keep pushing. You know, and then because one of the ways in which decolonising is being seen as being done, or it's through reading lists. This idea that, okay, well, I've got, you know, a brown person, black person, or someone on my reading list. Look, I've done decolonising now. Okay, but actually, decolonising involves really hard work. It involves culture change. So you can see it if it's something that's done very easily. It's not easy to do. Yeah.
Indeed, it's very delicate, interesting, and very laborious. Like this reminds me of Ashalma Bombay's comment about decolonization, where he said that it doesn't mean to close doors on European or other traditions, but it's defining clearly what the center is, where the center lies. So, talking about decolonization and the efforts that we're doing in the universities, and as you said, that it's very delicate and very like a lot of toil and hard work. Devesh, how would you respond to the arguments which claim that there is a certain sort of trade off in decolonization goals? That is, there are limits to how much can be taught in the modules or the courses that we take up. How much do you replace from the existing reading list? So, how would you advise academics to make choice of the topic selection which balances inclusiveness to this conciseness?
Yeah, thanks again. In fact, I'll first also add to what Claire was saying, the tick box thing, right? Of course, I mean, let's say my example, right? So I'm a non-white person, so BME in university context, like UK context, which I don't think anyone identifies as BME, but we all have to use the system, so we use it. That's fine, right? But I am also a queer person, right? So that's a tick, 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 right? So one could say that someone like me would fit into a tick box. What we do, and it's not only me who's doing it, by the way, so it's never about individual, but collectively, and we have got a Black and minority ethnic staff network, a colleagues network, which is very active within our university. It has come about as a product and labor of a Black female colleague of mine, and then me working with her, and then others working with each other, right? What we realize, of course, is we are different, and we never use one identity against other. Because someone like me with a very privileged Indian, cis male Savarna background can be used to say, oh, everything is fine. But consciously, we work hard not to allow that, right? So what has been working within our university, and I can give you an example where anytime I give a speech, I said, I'm not tick box. I'll never fit into a box. I'm too queer to fit into a box, right? Now, people laugh at it because if I say I'm too queer to fit into a box, but that's the fact. With the intersectionality, right? It's intersectionality that matters. So the ways in which we have managed within our university challenge the tick box approach to one where we are quite radical compared to most universities, and I can say it not because it's my university, because we're working hard. We're not there, but we are moving because we recognize that decolonizing is a process, not an end product. We recognize that it has to go hand in hand with diversifying, because decolonizing, and if you look at theoretical decolonization, much of it can be, again, I mean, certain kind of writing with certain kind of privileged people from non-Western world speaking about it, right? So we are very clear that you have to take into account other forms of diversification. That's why here we use decolonizing and diversifying, right? To challenge the tick box. So you could see that if, let's say, if I was going to tick box and say, Claire and Tosi, if you tick, but you challenge that, no, we are not going to tick box. Of course, I'll be conscious and I'll learn. So we do recognize it's a learning process, right? So education is about learning. That's how we have not fully formed human beings. We always evolve, because that's what education is. Now, in terms of the practicality of it, right? How to decolonize curriculum, what advice I'll give, I don't have an advice because I don't have an answer. But I do know that we need to start somewhere, number one. Number two, it cannot be imposed. When you impose, it becomes tokenistic, right? Or resistance. It has to be done in partnership. But we also recognize there will always be contestation. We can't expect everyone to sing and dance happily together. Yes, we are all decolonizing. It doesn't work like that, right? So we have to expect certain kind of contestation and be ready for it. But how do we fight that contestation, struggle with it? It's through collective action. This is why it's very important that we do not see decolonizing or diversifying in both, right, as individual initiatives. So individuals have to sort of stick their neck out, as Claire was pointing out. We sometimes need to do it, but we work with each other within university, but beyond university. Partnership helps. So in our case, the reason why our colleagues network, Black and White colleague network, worked was, of course, because we had buy-in from senior management, but because we work very closely with students. And remember, students are consumers. You can use that language of students as consumers to get what you want, but also work with outside university. So we connect with other Black and minority ethnic colleagues, network, staff network in different universities. So we have to work with each other and be part of the wider thing. So in terms of, you're right, like I teach post-colonial politics, right? Post-colonial politics international, but they're only 12 weeks. 1 week sort of student engagement. So 11 weeks. I have to cover China. I have to cover India. I have to cover all kinds of places. I have to cover gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity. And of course, I start by saying that to cover gender in one mod, okay, there are gender modules. So it's not that it doesn't happen, but it's sort of almost violent. But what other option do I have? Either I don't cover it or I cover it. So I decide to therefore at least introduce in short. And I always find Kimberly Crenshaw's work very important and interesting around intersectionality to remind students in particular that um, all of us inhabit intersectional identities in any case, right? But sometimes we are aware of it, sometimes we're not aware of it. Sometimes we are aware, but we don't care. Ultimately, I would still say that rather than looking for a perfect solution, we should do it, get it wrong, change it, rather than not do it at all, right? So for only advice is that rather than thinking for a perfect answer where we should cover an entire module, let's say China, entire module India, entire module Tibet or Kashmir or Kurdistan, or entire module gender sexuality, which are there. If I'm teaching it from my perspective, I'd rather cover all of it, give sort of tease students, inspire them, and then encourage them to focus on whatever they want to focus on. So I would say make a start, do it rather than wait for a perfect solution.
Absolutely, I quite agree, and it's always said that it's worth a start than sitting in the fence, and that's what actually got us into this. And another very important and interesting point that you raised was that it's not an end product; it's a process, and that's what was actually at the back of our mind when we were discussing how do we actually frame it and what should be the title. Should it be decolonizing, decolonization? There was a wider debate about these things. And yes, definitely, we agree that it's a process. The moment it comes as an end product, it becomes tokenistic in some way or the other. Claire, what are some of the criticisms? Because you're an activist, you've been working in this regard in this field for quite some time. So, what are some of the criticisms that you've encountered regarding decolonizing academia? And what is your way of responding to that?
Okay, yeah, criticisms. Well, I think one of the criticisms is that universities work very well, and that for instance, UEA is a very prestigious university. Attracts the students. It's doing very well. We've always done well. I'm known in my field. So if you've got that coming from that kind of I guess it's a tradition that people want to kind of cling on to it and see it as being, this is something that people hold dear. And they see it as being, deeply critical, and people take it, quite personally. Like this is what I've been training for. This is what I've been doing for years and years and years. And I've got the publications, I've got this, I've got support from students. So what are you talking about? And then, so there's a question about what the problem is. And this question keeps recurring. And, there's so much evidence to show what the problem is. There are so many, there are the reports, there are the reports from students, there's so much information out there, but often there's a continual kind of ask for more evidence and more evidence. And I'm at the point now where I just think that the evidence is there, and I can't exhaust myself by trying to convince people that this is what it is. It's already very clear, and you can keep trying to convince and waste a lot of time with people who actually aren't willing to see what is very apparent, what students saying apparent, what it's really clear. And then I think another argument is to do with kind of falling standards, which is related to that. It's about, okay, well, this is our field, and has a certain amount of kudos, and then you're asking us to do this other thing. And often this other thing is related to people who, from other places look differently, brown, black, whatever, and that's seen as being somehow, and I find that kind of conflation with making the change and falling standards interesting. So you're kind of basically what's really being implied here is that once we introduce these more perspectives or more ideas that from these people from this other place who don't look like us, that means that the standards aren't the same. So what's really being said here? What's really being said is that ideas and knowledge associated with whiteness have value. There's an admission. How can that not be seen? So I find those arguments really, really interesting. I think they're really interesting and really, just kind of asking questions. Well, why should that mean? Why, for instance, in literature, does it mean that if we're looking at text by Zora Neale Hurston, an African American writer who I really like, why is it that those conversations are not intellectually rigorous, that we're somehow kind of doing literature a disservice because we're looking at text by a range of different authors, perhaps, or thinking about doing things differently, thinking about our teaching methods as just. For me, it just seems really strange because what we're supposed to be doing in universities is kind of asking questions all the time. We're seeking academic excellence. We're seeking excellence. And in order to do that, we have to change. We can't, excellence doesn't come with just doing the same thing over and over again and not asking questions. It comes through, hard work and saying, okay, let me listen, let me look, let me be open to different ideas, different perspectives, different ways of knowing and understanding the world.
Absolutely, quite agree with you. Like it's all about asking questions and not take anything as a given and evolve with time and as our perspectives evolve. Dibyesh, I know you as an academic activist who's been quite active beyond academia as well. Like if I talk about the global South, especially the South Asian context, you've been quite active there as well, visiting those places, interacting with the academics, scholars. Say, for example, Kashmir. I know that for sure. India, Nepal. So how far do you see this wave of decolonizing academia making inroads into the academic spaces of these former colonies? And if we are to talk about wider academic networks in this regard between global South and global North, how can that be formed? What could mutually be taken up so that we reinforce these even within academia and beyond academia as well?
Okay, thanks for that very, very important question, because if you had asked me that question 20 years ago, maybe you were not born then, but when 20 years ago,
I would.
Different. Okay, 20 years ago, or when I started my research, it would be different from what I have now. At this point in time, I think I'm quite pessimistic about knowledge production in emerging powers. Let me focus on emerging powers, including China and India, because this is my area, right? Emerging powers. So I'm not talking of smaller states. I'm talking big states that see themselves as the next global powers. Knowledge production around humanities and social sciences is deeply arrogant. It's very hierarchical. So the kind of things that, when we talk of white privilege here and look at the ways in which, I said there is at least a legal framework. I'm not saying legal framework leads to it. Right? When I say that tick box, at least they have to tick a box. In certain contexts, you don't even have to tick a box. Sometimes in India, it's different because of the affirmative actions on caste. They're very careful. But the Brahminical system has been very clever in India in subverting various movements of social justice. So the way I see is, yes, there is demand for challenging Eurocentrism. There's a demand for challenging European dominance. That's very much there. So Britain and British ideas will not be seen as something superior to Indian ideas. Right? But that challenge to European ideas is not from a position of decolonizing. It's from a position of a Brahminical colonization, which is that, look, Europeans should keep out, the white people should keep out, and let us deal with our India. And how do we deal with our India? We deal with our India by going back to and taking modern ideas and going back to some idealized ancient knowledge. What is that idealized ancient knowledge? Which is not in reality, that's how they imagine, right? Is one that is not Christian, one that is not Muslim, right? And one that allows the Indian state to become a strong colonial power in the region. And same is in case of China. China is even worse, the knowledge production there, right? So it's a very predictable but curious mix of taking Western knowledge production, Western institutions. State is a Western institution, right? Not in capital. Sovereign states are Western institutions and European institutions. Taking those states but rejecting other aspects, right? So there's that thing there. So in my own interaction, I mean, of course, it depends. I have found students to be more interested or interesting. So the kind of work, for instance, I do on be it on activism around Tibet or even in Kashmir, which is seen as activism, though I see it as scholarship, right? It's a mix of it. I find students in India, I'm talking India, or in Kashmir, yes, you'd expect because of course Kashmir is a colonized place, right, by India. So they would like any kind of scholarship that critiques India. That's fine. But even in India, I found students to be more open-minded, recognizing that the Indian state is colonial in Kashmir. But what I find is most academics too, even those who use the language of decolonization sometimes, to be very quiet. So this is what I remember I started by saying how in UK also we find that a lot of us are trained to be radical in theory, not in practice. Something similar is taking place in India. In China, let's not even talk of it. You cannot be a radical scholar. You cannot be because you cannot do anything that's challenging of the state, right? So finally, I would say is when we talk of decolonizing academia, should we be dispirited here because what's happening in global south? No. But what we need to avoid is we need to avoid certain kind of exoticization, right? So the ways in which Europeans exoticize the non-West, we, and I'm assuming we who share anti-colonial, decolonial in a spirit, should not exoticizing certain native identities elsewhere and say, oh, we need to go back to Asia, go back to Africa, go back somewhere and take indigenous knowledge production and somehow use it here because then we'll be better. We need to respect indigenous knowledge production, but recognize that possibly indigenous knowledge production in most parts are already a product of mix of coloniality and anti-coloniality, right? And one final point, I mean, I was just looking at the calendar, you can see there, which is, I mean, it might know, Claire might not. It's from Kashmir. It's a person who has been disappeared by Indian state. Now, I use that image a lot whenever I talk because for me, knowledge production on Kashmir, what I've learned hasn't come from scholars, including Kashmiri scholars, right? It has come from, it largely has come from engaging with people. Now, I'm not saying that's a better knowledge production, but all I can say is when you engage with any people, doesn't matter. I mean, Kashmir is just an example, but what you get and what you learn, how to bring both together, for me, that has to be at the heart of decolonizing academia, right? So I'm not again glorifying Kashmiri people I'm interacting with somehow that they're the native in form, I'm knowledge producer. Not at all. For me, it's about co-production of knowledge. And one final point. So in my own work on Tibet, for instance, I'm very clear that largely it was Western production of knowledge on Tibet or Chinese production, right? So someone like me is not, though I'm in Britain, I'm Western, but I'm not white. So I would never fit. But I still have privilege with the Tibetan refugees living in India, Nepal, and elsewhere. For me, the initiative, and which to an extent has worked, is always see myself as being a co-producer of knowledge with Tibetans in exile, right? It's quite important that, and I keep saying final point, right? I keep saying final point, not final, one more thing. But it is important. And as someone who's experienced with age and everything, but whatever we do, we need to protect ourselves also. Self-care is radical. And I'm saying self-care is radical in an area which is very, which is academia, where there's a lot of focus on constantly being productive. Specifically for those of us who inhabit non-white, non-hegemonic spaces, it's important that yes, we fight, we struggle, we negotiate, we navigate, but we also take break, we also breathe, we also learn to laugh, smile, and take care, because it is a very brutal journey, but we can only manage if we take care of ourselves.
Oh, thank you so very much, Dibyesh. And I actually love the calendar, the APDP calendar behind you. So we're actually running out of time, and we switch to the second part where we try to take up the questions that have come from the audience. So if I'm looking, there has been a volley of questions. The first question has come from Surya Simon. It reads that the initiative of Decolonizing Academia has come from the students, as both of you have pointed out. Academics have been crucial to furthering the voice of students and providing resources, channels. However, individuals in leadership positions, such as the VC, have hoped on the decolonial bandwagon and have started co-opting the efforts of the students and few academics. How can we avoid such co-opting and holding people in leadership positions accountable while continuing decolonizing efforts within the academic constraints? If any one of you would like to answer that.
I mean, okay, I'll go first. Okay, co-option, there's always a risk, that's true. But look at all ideas have been co-opted at various points in time, but then also adapted and adopted, right? The way I would say is, if let's say certain senior management people want to co-opt, that will create some space, right? How do we then use that co-option to then further our agenda, right? Because if you look at democratization, I'm not talking about democracy in political system, but democratic struggle, right? All these struggles are democratic struggles in a way to humanize life. It has always worked on working together, working against, working, not working, co-option, adoption, adaption. So for me, so long as we are aware it's being taken place, use it in our own way, negotiate with outsiders, shame people if it's required, or appeal to the good senses from time to time, I think that's possible.
Yeah. So there's another question by Eugenie Samia. I'm curious about the notion of unconscious racism and Islamophobia and how much of a role this plays. Claire, if you'd like to answer this one.
Yeah, okay. So the question about unconscious racism and Islamophobia. I guess unconscious racism is an interesting one. In some ways, unconscious racism can be used really conveniently as a way of saying, okay, well, I just didn't mean it. That these things happen, they're not intended. And so it's almost as if our sympathies must lie with the perpetrator. I've found that in my own experiences working in universities or just in life anyway, that we're surrounded by unconscious racism that actually manifests as microaggressions. And these microaggressions, I mean, the word micro might be deceiving. We're continually being bombarded with these messages, comments, that make us feel less, that make us feel small, which they're violent. These are instances of violence, and they accumulate. And I agree that we need to think about well-being. And that relates to Islamophobia. It relates to racism more generally. It's very harmful. So I hope that answers the question. But it's a really difficult one. It's a really difficult. I think we need to recognise it when it happens, and we do need to call it out. Again, this goes to kind of calling it out, whether it was unconscious or not. We need to not only protect ourselves, but also help that other person. That's a generous gesture to say, look, this is what happened. This is how it made me feel. And I think whether that's about Islamophobia or any other form of ignorance, basically.
Yeah, that's right. So there's another question by Annapurna Menon for Professor Dibyesh.
Yeah.
What about resistance from fellow academics who claim to be leftist, progressive, and everything, but follow stringent gatekeeping when it comes to decolonizing, also seeing decolonizing itself as liberal, negative, often excluding early career academics as being too young, liberal, inexperienced, etc. How do we collaborate with such academics?
Yeah, again, thanks, Anna, for this question. I mean, we know that resistance, I mean, we imagine that the ideal enemy for us would be this some right-wing, straight white male, right? That's the kind of thing, or whatever, in this context, straight white male who's there. And of course, the allies will have would be the liberals or the radicals or even very radical people, white, non-white, does not matter. But in our own experience, in my own experience of academia, of course, there's no clear overlap between identities and politics. And sometimes someone might write amazing books and even come across as amazing, like whatever, someone like us. But when they're managing, you find that they're replicating certain hierarchies where they exclude the young people. That is the harsh reality of any institution, including academia, right? That's it. Now, how to collaborate, for me, the important thing is we cannot afford not to collaborate. I mean, we cannot afford not to engage. So we need to continue to engage, work with, work against, work around in various ways. So again, I'm not giving a clear answer, but there is no clear answer. And it is the fact that, and sadly, I mean, with what's happening with pandemic and everything, the situation for younger academics is going to be even more difficult in the coming years. So how do you deal with teaching part, research part, activism part, politics part, also get job? I mean, it's going to be very difficult. But I do think that working, being flexibility does matter. Flexibility is important. And I mean, while adopting certain position, which is very purist position, I also believe that we cannot always be purist, right? If a university we know is using decolonizing or something else in a tokenistic way, they create space, use that space, and then expand that space. And again, I do think that we can learn something, not that the queer movement has got it right. Remember, it's also a process. I do think that as a queer person, the experiences we have through movement is very relevant for this. So let's say here we talk of whether pride should be celebration or protest, right? There's whole debate, and some of us participate, some of us don't participate in pride, saying, no, it's commercialization. But at least we have the right to go to pride. Now think of if you are in country where you are criminalized for being queer, you cannot even talk of whether pride is a protest or pride is a celebration. So what I mean is that let's negotiate with law, negotiate with system, challenge it, work in whatever creative way possible, and then hopefully it will work. But as I said, let's not take for granted that just because someone is radical in theory in whatever is necessarily very good human being in terms of supporting someone else.
Yeah, quite right. So we have another question from Alice in Beaufort Coles. I hope I read your name right. So how does decolonizing work when the supervisors, academics, reviewers of the journal's books still do not recognize that knowledge is also produced differently, especially citing African scholars or the unknown Black writers? The papers are not accepted, or research students struggle to bring that in their PhDs. For example, I write about African young people, and my research relates to African feminism, Black writers. Claire?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's also a very tricky question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful. I think the idea of kind of making sure that, I mean, it's quite I mean, it's an isolating process enough being a PhD student in a university institution, and being a PhD student who's kind of working against the grain and trying to bring new ways of doing things, new ways of looking at the world is even more difficult. And so I appreciate there are systems and structures in there that just may not be ready for the kind of research that individuals are doing. I think as much as people can get support outside of the academy and within the academy and make this less of a kind of lonely process, because there's a sense of feeling, okay, well, it's me against the system. But if you can kind of surround yourself with people as much as possible, which goes back to Dibyesh's point about self-care, that this is a really difficult. We talk about decolonizing as if it's the institution. These are institutions, but these are individuals within institutions who are going through really, really difficult experiences, and the impacts of the lack of decolonial action is quite severe. So I really sympathise, but I think do the best you can to get support from others, and use whatever channels, whatever resources you can. It's difficult for me to say, okay, this is the plan, but I just think that idea about just kind of surrounding yourself and pushing as much as you can, and there may be staff within the institution itself who you can go to and seek advice, but just use whatever channels you can within the system itself to support you.
Oh, absolutely. The clock's ticking and we've nearly run out of time. So I have one last question from Manimporong Dotulong. I have a question for Professor Anand. How does turning to the study of non-Western colonialisms enrich our understandings of the process of decolonizing above and beyond what we already know about Western colonialisms?
Thanks for that question. I mean, in fact, the way I say is, in fact, by studying non-Western colonialism, what it shows us that colonization and decolonization has nothing to do with specific racialized ethnic national identity, but it's a power relation. So by recognizing that anyone can be colonial or anyone can be colonized, we take it out of certain people with certain color or certain kind of geographical location as being the exclusive colonizers, right? And that's what it does. So in a way, for me, the focus on non-Western colonialism, along with the focus on Western colonialism, enables us to recognize the practices of bigotry, injustices, and exclusions that are taking place in different parts of the world, challenge our own hypocrisy. And I say we're not perfect, right? We all have to work on us. We recognize that education is about educating ourselves, educating others, engaging with each other. Recognize that the way colonization is a process, decolonization has to be a process, but it can only be a process where we first recognize that there's a problem. Not adopt a position that, just because I'm Chinese and therefore I can't be colonial, or just because I'm an Indian or Pakistani colonized formally by someone else, so we can't be colonized, right? In a sense, for me, it's a constant hard work that we do. And just to round up, because we won't have time for all other questions, thank you for different questions you put up. I mean, all I can say is, look, it's not easy. We do talk of support within university, we talk of how can we support, but also we have to recognize that beyond the point, we are alone. Not alone means alone, but it is a struggle. It won't be easy. So where we have reached so far, because thousands of people have struggled, given the life, given the career over centuries to get us recognized as human beings. So when we're talking of what support can university or institutions provide us to be who we are, that's an important question. But we also have to think of what can we do to support each other and fight for each other, not fight for ourselves, but fight for each other to genuinely come up with an intersectional understanding of injustices, which then allows us to decolonize academia and diversify.
Absolutely, and what a beautiful note to end on. It is a struggle and it is a process that has to continue. And these discourses and conversations, like they are the best ways through which we exchange our ideas, then understand and try to adjust and address the inequalities embedded in our systems. Claire, Dibyesh, thank you so very much for joining us, and a very big thank you to our audiences for their support, cooperation, and questions. We shall shortly update you about our third session very soon. Till then, thank you so very much and goodbye.
Thank you.